The presidencies of James Madison and James Monroe. In this video, we are talking about the years 1809 through 1825, a 16-year period in which two presidents each served 8 terms. These are the 4th and 5th presidents. So James Madison's presidency, which was 1809 to 1817, that is most known for the War of 1812, which we'll talk about a lot today, in which the U.S. proved it could survive as a strong and free nation. James Monroe, whose presidency was 1817 to 1825, he had actually fought in the Revolutionary War in Washington's army. He had spent that brutal winter at Valley Forge with him. He was Thomas Jefferson's minister to Britain, and then he was James Madison's Secretary of State and the next in line for the Democratic-Republican nomination for president. He won the election of 1816 in a landslide, and his presidency is most known for the acquisition of Florida, the Missouri Compromise, and the Monroe Doctrine, all of which we will talk about today. Now, like Jefferson, Madison used diplomacy and economic pressure to deal with European nations during the Napoleonic Wars. But unlike Jefferson, Madison actually went to war with the War of 1812. So after the repeal of Jefferson's very harmful Embargo Act that really backfired on America, Madison signed the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, and this opened American trade with all nations except for Britain and France. This was supposed to be, it was intended to be a way to revitalize the economy while still staying neutral in the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France. But the economy remained pretty bad because Britain and France had been our biggest trading partners. So Madison signed what was called Macon's Bill No. 2, which restored U.S. trade with Britain and France. However, it said that if either Britain or France would stop seizing American merchant ships and respect our neutral rights at sea, then the U.S. would keep trading with that nation, but stop trading with that nation's enemy. So, for example, if Britain agreed to stop seizing our ships, we would keep trading with Britain, but stop trading with France to try to maybe cripple them in that war. Well, Napoleon seized this opportunity and announced that he would agree to that he would agree to stop seizing American merchant ships. Therefore, President Madison, he embargoed U.S. trade with Britain and continued to trade with France. However, Napoleon was a big fat liar, and he had no intention of stopping the seizure of American ships. So this really backfired on the U.S. Our ships continued to be seized, and our economy remained crippled because we embargoed Britain again. Now, from America's perspective, Britain was very much antagonizing the United States. From the American perspective, the British had never really stopped to oppress them. They were still trying to control them, even though they weren't a part of the British Empire anymore. And there were 2 ways in particular that Britain was antagonizing the U.S. that, in American eyes, amounted to acts of war. And they came from 2 different directions. So from the East, America very much economically relied on the free passage of their ships across the Atlantic. They relied on that for trade. And the British did not respect neutral rights during the Napoleonic Wars. But they were seizing American ships, and worst of all, they were impressing American sailors. Impressment is when you take sailors from a ship that belongs to another country and you force them into your army or navy. And you had all these American sailors being impressed into the British Navy when their ships were seized on the Atlantic. So that was an aggression from the British from the east of America. And then also, the British were antagonizing the Americans from the West, again, in the American opinion. Conflict with Native Americans was a constant problem for white settlers, and the British were offering aid and encouragement to Indians on the western frontier in fighting American settlers. One example was the British support of the Native American leader Tecumseh. Now, Tecumseh was a Shawnee warrior who united several tribes and most famously fought General William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. Tecumseh would later die in the War of 1812, but the fact that the British were supporting him and other Native Americans was seen as treacherous in the eyes of Americans. So from America's perspectives, Britain was attacking them from the east and from the west, and something had to be done. Now, in 1810, a group of young Democratic Republicans known as Warhawks won congressional seats. And when this group took office in 1811, a couple people emerged as the leaders of this young congressional group, including Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And they started to clamor for war with Britain. They wanted to go to war with Britain for three reasons. They wanted to defend American honor, gain Canada. They wanted to expand not just west, but also north. And they also wanted to destroy Indian resistance on the frontier. And they thought war with Britain could accomplish all three of those purposes. President Madison was very much influenced by them. They were of his party. They were the younger generation. They were loud and they were convincing. And Madison, influenced by them, appealed to Congress to declare war on Britain. Congress voted to do that. It was a very narrow vote. It was very close, but they narrowly voted to declare war on Britain in 1812. Now, most Americans from the South and from the West supported the war, but most Northerners did not. Some opposed the war for economic reasons. For example, New England merchants who were finally starting to make money again now that the embargoes were gone. They did not want to go to war with Britain because that would cut off their ability to trade with Britain. Then you had some Americans who had religious opposition to the war because America was mostly Protestant and Britain was mostly Protestant, whereas France was mostly Catholic. So a lot of devout Protestants in America said, why should we go to war with a Protestant nation, Britain, while we are, still in a good relationship with the Catholic nation of France? And then others believed that the war violated the classic principles of the Democratic Republican Party. For example, the commitment to limited federal power and to maintaining the peace, things that Jefferson really promoted during his time in office. Now, during the Revolutionary War, the British were heavily favored to win, but they didn't. Now, this time, it was fairly similar because Britain was still 40 times wealthier than America. They had way more money, way more resources than the United States. And so this time round, it was also expected that they would win. In addition to their wealth, they also had the superior navy by far. Britain had by far the world's largest navy. They had about 1,000 ships, whereas the U.S. Navy had 17 ships. So very, very outnumbered there. However, a big reason why the U.S. was able to hold its own in the first years of the war was because during the first 2 years of the War of 1812, Britain was simultaneously fighting Napoleon much closer to their home, and that took priority. That's where the bulk of their 1,000 ships were. That's where the bulk of their money was targeted. So most of their attention and supplies were directed at him, and the War of 1812 in the U.S. and Canada was kind of an afterthought. So since Britain had the superior navy, Madison based America's hopes for victory on two things: Napoleon's continued success in Europe that would keep Britain distracted, and two, a U.S. land campaign against Canada. He wanted to keep this war on land because he thought that on the seas, America would lose. So U.S. forces invaded Canada. They invaded Canada from 3 points: Detroit, Niagara, and Lake Champlain. If you look at the map here, Detroit is right here on the border of Canada, Niagara is here on the border of Canada, and Lake Champlain is right here. Britain swiftly repulsed these American invasions. There were various American attacks, most famously the attack at Fort York in modern-day Toronto, which is right here. But the British were able to repulse these American invasions and send the U.S. retreating back across the border into America. The U.S. Navy, though, was actually able to achieve some notable victories. So where our Army failed, our Navy actually unexpectedly succeeded, due largely to the superior shipbuilding of American ships. So while we had fewer ships, our shipbuilding techniques were superior. Also, due to the courage of American sailors. That's another big reason why the U.S. had victories on the seas, including the courageous actions of many free African Americans who voluntarily fought for the U.S. in this war. Now, in late 1812, the USS Constitution, which was nicknamed Old Ironsides, It raised American morale by defeating and sinking a British ship off the coast of Nova Scotia, which is right up here. Okay, and the USS Constitution was called Old Ironsides because it was said that cannonballs bounced off the sides of the ships as if they were made of iron. And that's what we mean by superior ship making of the U.S. You can still see Old Ironsides. You can still tour it. It's in the port of Boston today. Private U.S. citizens with boats also got in on the action, both for patriotism as well as for profit, because they realized they could capture British merchant ships and keep all of the supplies, and that's exactly what they did. So as always with war, you're going to have some people getting involved to make money. However, the British Navy had success as well on the seas. For example, they successfully blockaded the American coast, which is where they put ships along the coast, and they kind of patrol the seas here in order to make sure that trade ships don't come in or out of the U.S. coast. And this really crippled trading and fishing both for the American coastal economy, which really hurt. The most important naval battle of the war was fought in 1813, actually on Lake Erie. So most of the naval fighting of the War of 1812 didn't happen in the Atlantic. It actually happened on the Great Lakes. This one is Lake Erie right here. And this was a 3-hour engagement, heavy casualties, and it ended in a U.S. victory. There was another battle on the water called the Battle of Thames River. This was near Detroit in modern-day Ontario, and this was the battle in which Tecumseh, the great Indian warrior, was killed. Then in 1814, the British fleet was defeated on Lake Champlain up here. And this defeat forced the British to retreat and abandon their plan to invade New York and New England. And they instead decided to invade, instead of here, they decided to invade the Chesapeake region right here with Maryland and Virginia. Now, after Napoleon's defeat in 1814, the British were able to focus all their efforts on America. They were able to send more troops to the U.S., and the British Army landed on the Chesapeake Bay and marched through Washington, D.C. This was the famous battle where they burned the White House, and the First Lady, Dolly Madison, famously saved that picture of George Washington gesturing. And they burned both the White House and the Capitol, and burned other government buildings in the city. This was seen as revenge for when the U.S. Burned the government building in York, modern-day Toronto. The British also attempted to take Baltimore. They bombarded it with their ships at sea, but Fort McHenry, which was there to defend Baltimore, really held out. It held out after an entire night of bombardment from British ships, and in the morning the flag was still flying and Fort McHenry was still holding strong. Now, the person who witnessed this and immortalized it in a song was Francis Scott Key. He wrote of this battle in the Star-Spangled Banner, where he talks about the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. He's talking about the bombardment of Fort McHenry in 1814 and how the U.S. held out and won that battle. Also in 1814, you have a famous battle in the Mississippi Territory in modern-day Alabama. It's called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, in which Andrew Jackson defeated the Creek Indians. The reason he waged war on the Creek Indians was because they were a British ally. The British then tried to take the Mississippi River. Okay, since this campaign to invade up here didn't work, this campaign to invade from the Atlantic coast didn't work, they then went through the Gulf of Mexico, and their plan was to take the Mississippi River. However, on January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson led a force of frontiersmen, free African Americans, and Creoles, and defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. That's why still to this day in New Orleans you have Jackson Square with a big statue of Andrew Jackson. Now this battle, interestingly, was actually fought 2 weeks after the peace agreement was made. It's just that word hadn't gotten all the way down there that the war was over, so it was an unnecessary victory. Now, by 1814, the British were very weary of war. They had fought Napoleon for more than a decade at this point, and they were now facing the prospect of trying to maintain the peace in Europe, now that Napoleon is exiled on an island. At the same time, James Madison came to the recognition that the US would be unable to win a decisive victory if the war lasted any longer. So both sides wanted an end to the war, so they sent delegates to Ghent, Belgium, in order to negotiate peace. They negotiated for a bit, and on Christmas Eve, they signed the Treaty of Ghent, the peace agreement, and the terms were simple. The fighting was going to stop, and all borders were to return to where they were before the war started in 1812. So nobody lost or gained any territory by the end of this war. So while the borders did not change, the War of 1812 still has a very important legacy. Toward the war's end, you have anti-war Federalists beginning to clamor for secession, especially people in New England were saying we need to secede from the Union because we don't want to be involved in this war. The Democratic Republicans are Warhawks. We don't want to be a part of this anymore. We just want to trade and be merchants up in New England. But then after the war, there was a surge of patriotism, and the Federalists who had been against the war were very much denounced. And this essentially killed the Federalist Party, a Federalist Party that had already been basically on life support by the end of the Jeffersonian era, essentially died by the end of the War of 1812. But this precedent of clamoring for secession and threatening secession because they don't like what the majority of the Union is doing, that precedent, that example was set. And that example would be followed about 40 years later by the southern states. This war also confirmed that the United States was here to stay, that it could defend itself as an independent country, that our victory in the Revolutionary War wasn't just a fluke, that we were actually going to exist long term. Also, Britain stopped trying to control American trade as a result of this war. And Britain and America actually became allies after this. So two nations that fought two fierce wars together then became allies and have been allies ever since for the past 200 years. Britain has been one of America's closest allies. Also, Canada and the U.S. have been close allies ever since. There have been no other attempts for the U.S. to take over Canada. At this point, America also went from being simply an independent nation to being a major world power. The U.S. economy rebounded too for the first time in about 2 decades. Britain also stopped allying with Native Americans after this. They stopped trying to spur Native Americans to war against white settlers, and this forced Native Americans to surrender large areas of land to white settlement. So then we get to James Monroe. So James Monroe was elected in 1816, and his election brought about a time that historians call the era of good feelings. That's because that was the time, that was the title given by a specific newspaper writer during this era. And it's called the era of good feelings mostly because it was marked by a spirit of nationalism, patriotism, American optimism, and really goodwill between the states after the War of 1812. The founding generation had mostly passed away by this point. Jefferson and Adams were still alive. Madison was still alive, but many of the other founders had died. Washington, Franklin, and Hamilton had died by this point. Many of the others had. And the ones who were still alive were very old and retired from public life. And the younger generation, the people who were in power now and who were voting, they had very different priorities. They were not so much focused on our relationship with England or France. They didn't look to the east so much across the Atlantic. Instead, they were looking towards the west. They were focused on westward expansion, industrial development, focusing on our continent specifically. Didn't really have much interest in European affairs. During this time, you have protective tariffs being used for the first time. They were implemented to offset new European economic competition because now that all the embargoes were lifted, you have a lot of competition with European merchants to where American merchants were saying, hey, we need to have an edge here, we need to be able to sell. So tariffs were put in, which are taxes on imports, in order to help U.S. merchants make more money. Another thing that happened during this time was the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Now remember, the first Bank of the United States was established by Alexander Hamilton, but the charter of that national bank had expired in 1811. And so now you had the second Bank of the United States being chartered under James Monroe. States were instructed to fund roads and canals themselves. Monroe was still very much about a small federal government. It was not willing to have federal infrastructure bills, and therefore states funded their own roads and canals. One really big discouragement during the otherwise called era of good feelings was the Panic of 1819. This was the most severe economic crisis since the ratification of the Constitution. And in 1819, the Second Bank of the United States, they tightened credit. They stopped giving out loans. They sent out debt collectors and started to put people in debtors' prisons because they said people are buying too much on credit. They're not paying it back. We really need to tighten that up if we want to strengthen our economy. But unfortunately, the opposite happened. They wanted to control inflation because having more debt means more inflation. But by tightening up on credit, it actually caused state banks to close because they couldn't pay their debts, and the value of money fell, which is deflation. So unemployment, bankruptcies, imprisonment for debt, all of that really increased due to the deflation of the value of the US dollar, and so $1 didn't buy as much. So really it was the same effect as inflation, which is what they were trying to control. This depression was most severe in the West, especially for Western farmers. And the Bank of the United States were foreclosing on large amounts of Western farmland that people had bought on credit. They had bought this cheap land on credit, but then once the bank foreclosed upon it, that meant that well, they did that because they couldn't pay their mortgage anymore. They said, hey, pay up. The farmers couldn't, and so the banks foreclosed on it. And so these people who had been pioneers and braved, the conditions to go out west, now they had nowhere to live. Another hallmark of this time period was John Marshall's Supreme Court. Now, we talked about him earlier. Remember, he was appointed by John Adams back in 1800, and at this point, even getting into the 1820s, he is still the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he very much was continuing to shape American laws by the way he was interpreting the Constitution. His decisions consistently favored a strong central government over states' rights. So at a time when the Democratic Republicans, the small government states' rights party, was dominant throughout both the executive and legislative branches, at a time when the Federalist Party was pretty much dead, John Marshall remained the only Federalist still in power, and he had a lot of power. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The other justices very much followed his lead. Here are just a few major cases during Marshall's tenure on the Supreme Court that altered the U.S., even still to this day. Fletcher versus Peck in 1810. This was the first time the Supreme Court declared a state law to be unconstitutional and valid, and the Supreme Court has done that many times since. Martin v. Hunter's lease was in 1816, and this established the Supreme Court's jurisdiction over state courts in cases involving constitutional rights. Dartmouth College v. Woodward of 1819, this stated that a contract for a private corporation could not be altered by the state because the state of New Hampshire was wanting to take over Dartmouth College, which was originally a private institution. McCulloch versus Maryland, also in 1819, stated that federal laws are supreme over states' laws, and therefore a state could not tax a federal institution. And then finally, Gibbons v. Ogden in 1821, this established federal control of interstate commerce by ruling that monopolies, one company controlling an entire industry, was unconstitutional. Large areas of Indian land were opened for settlement after Indians, unfortunately, were driven from their lands by the victories of both William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812. William Henry Harrison won victories over Indian tribes in the Northwest here, and Andrew Jackson won victories over Indian tribes in the Southwest. So now you have large numbers of Native Americans being forced west of their lands here onto the plains, the frontier, and large numbers of Americans moving into former Indian land. The land west of the Appalachians proved to be very good for farming, so it was attractive for settlers to move there. New roads, canals, steamboats, and later railroads made it easier for pioneers to reach the frontier. More Europeans immigrated to the US as a result of this cheap land being offered to them in the West. And because of that, the population of the West doubled from 1812 to 1822. Now, it was still much smaller than the population of the North and of the South, but it was growing quickly. Now, soon after America's founding, a majority of Southern slave owners came to believe that slave labor was essential for their economy. And they developed this bizarre rationale for slavery that gave both religious and political justification for continuing to hold human beings in lifelong bondage. But then as America expanded westward, a big question was, okay, slavery is in the South, it's not in the North, but what about the West? Will slavery exist in the West? Well, Southerners certainly wanted it to, but Northerners did not want it to. So as America expanded westward, Westerners could not agree on whether or not to permit or exclude slavery. Those settling in the Southwest usually wanted slavery for economic reasons, for labor in the cotton fields in Louisiana and Texas and Oklahoma, while those settling in the Northwest, places like modern-day North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Montana, they had no use for slavery, and therefore they were against slavery. As the U.S. expanded and new states were created, like the ones I just mentioned, the government tried to maintain what they called a sectional balance. They really wanted to keep the country together. They wanted the Union to remain one country, and they knew that slavery was the most controversial issue of the day. As one of my college professors explained it to us when I was in college, he said, this was abortion times 10, meaning if you even mentioned it at the dinner table, people would start shouting and people lost friends over this issue. It was extremely divisive. And so the government knew that if they, tried to solve this issue right away, it might cause a rift. And so they did what every bad marriage does, and they pushed the issue down the road and said, oh, well, we'll deal with this later. So at this point, they said, okay, let's try to appease both sides, and every time we bring in a new free state, we will bring in a new slave state. So this was called the sectional balance, and this is something that Congress pursued for about 60 years. One example of this is that in 1791, Vermont entered the United States as a free state. People in Vermont did not want slavery in their state, fair enough. But then in 1792, the government accepted Kentucky as a slave state in order to keep the balance, same number of slave states as free states. Okay, so this sectional balance is something that continued to be pursued for about 60 years. And because of this balance between slave and free states, Southern congressmen could block any attempt by Northern congressmen to roll back slavery, because Northern congressmen never had a large enough majority over Southern congressmen, because you kept having all these Southern slave states being admitted into the Union every time a free state was added. This sectional balance was preserved in 1820 with what was called the Missouri Compromise. This was one of the big events of Monroe's presidency. This admitted Missouri as a slave state, while at the same time admitting Maine, which used to be a part of Massachusetts, admitting that as a free state. And for the next 30 years, Americans were very much torn between nationalism and sectionalism, two very important terms for this time in U.S. history. Nationalism means loyalty to your country, in this case, loyalty to the U.S. Sectionalism means loyalty to your state or region. The regions, broadly put, were North, South, and West, and we'll get to those in just a second. First, let's talk about Monroe's foreign policy. So first, Monroe and Canada. Well, we had just had beef with Canada during the War of 1812, but then with the Treaty of Ghent, we had peace with Canada. And in 1817, the U.S. and Britain agreed to the Rush-Bagot Agreement, which was to strictly limit naval armament on the Great Lakes. They said, we had several battles during the War of 1812 on the Great Lakes. There's going to be no more battles there. So they limited the number of border fortifications along the U.S.-Canada border, and they limited the number of naval ships that can be on the Great Lakes. And so this created the U.S.-Canada border that would become, and still is, the longest unfortified boundary in the entire world. The U.S. and Britain also signed the Treaty of 1818, which improved relations even more by agreeing to shared fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, right here. Joint occupation of the Oregon Territory for 10 years, that's out here, and also the establishment of the 49th parallel, okay, you can see that here, as the new border between the U.S. and Canada. Okay, so this area in the blue was given from Britain to the U.S., and this area in the green was given from the U.S. to Britain. Monroe and Florida. At this time, Spain owned Florida, but Spain was having trouble governing it for a variety of reasons, mostly because during this time in the early 1800s, all of their colonies in Latin America, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, all of those Spanish colonies were revolting. They were having revolutions in an attempt to become independent, and most of them were very successful at it. If you've heard of Simón Bolívar, he was the leader of the Creole revolutions in modern-day northern South America. So Spain was very much preoccupied with those revolutions and therefore could not devote many governors to their Florida territory. Their troops were needed elsewhere. And because of these chaotic conditions, Florida was basically like the Wild West. And this permitted residents of Florida to sneak across the border into the U.S., conduct raids, steal things, sometimes even kill people, and then rush back across the border into Florida to safety. And they had no consequences for this. And because of that, President Monroe sent Andrew Jackson, the general, to Florida in order to put a stop to this. Andrew Jackson then overreacted and invaded Florida, destroyed Seminole villages, drove out the Spanish governor, and even hanged multiple Seminole chiefs and British traders who he had accused of aiding Seminoles. Spain was then worried that the U.S. would seize Florida by force, which they probably could have because Spain's military presence there was so minimal. And because of that, Spain decided to at least get what they could out of this deal, and they decided to sell Florida to the U.S. for about $5 million. This was the Florida Purchase Treaty of 1819. And the final piece of foreign policy for James Monroe was called the Monroe Doctrine. And this cannot be overstated about how influential this was to U.S. foreign policy for really the next century. Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, both believed that peace and prosperity for the U.S. and the entire Western Hemisphere depended on Europe staying away. Europe staying in their half of the world, the Eastern Hemisphere, and leaving the Western Hemisphere alone. Similarly, Americans had lost interest in European affairs by this point. The younger generation was not so interested in getting involved in Europe, and they wished only to focus on the land west of the Atlantic. Therefore, on December 2nd, 1823, James Monroe delivered this famous message to Congress in which he proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine. This was the belief that the U.S. should not interfere in the Eastern Hemisphere and that European powers are no longer welcome to colonize or wage war in the Western Hemisphere. And this remained America's mindset, our foreign policy, for nearly a century. So in the early 1800s, the Jeffersonian dream of a nation of independent yeoman farmers remained very strong in rural areas. That was kind of their reality. As the century progressed, however, more and more Americans started to embrace the Industrial Revolution, which has come from Europe. From 1800 to 1825, the U.S. population doubled, and then from 1825 to 1850, it doubled again. And this was due both to a high birth rate and to increased immigration from Europe. Because of this new population growth, America now had the need and the means, the need for and the means to have better transportation routes. And so they built canals, they built railroads, and they built roads. So an efficient network of interconnecting roads and canals for moving people, moving raw materials, and then moving manufactured goods was incredibly important to the development of both a national economy and an industrial economy in America. The longest road that was made was called Cumberland Road. That was the first interstate road. Went in between states. Like I said, most roads were just within the states, but this stretched 1,000 miles from Maryland to Illinois. The Erie Canal was basically a long man-made waterway that was dug from Lake Erie here all the way across the state of New York. That was completed in 1825, and that was vital in linking western farms to eastern cities. Then in the late 1820s, the first railroads were built, and that really revolutionized things as well. The market revolution occurred between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. This was a time when new innovations, new developments were really transforming the American economy. You have telegraphs, steamships, and railroads being built, and this improved both trade and transportation. Roads were built and factories were invented, and this shifted the U.S. from a society based on subsistence agriculture to a society where people worked outside of the home. So the final thing here is sectionalism, all right? Sectionalism means having devotion to your part of the country more than to the country itself. And although the U.S. was young and vibrant in the 1820s, it was still a very fragile union, with sectionalism as an ever-present and growing concern for people. And as I said, the three sections of the nation were the North, the South, and the West. And many Americans felt much more comradeship, much more loyalty to their region than to the nation as a whole. In fact, the term United States was used as a plural noun. People said the United States are instead of the United States is. And we will get into the three sections in the next video.